So I'm really delighted to welcome to speak to us today Monica McGill from CS Education Research, CSEdresearch.org, Rebecca Vivian from the University of Adelaide, Elizabeth Cole from the University of Glasgow, and the title, I can't remember the full title of the talk, but it's around METRECC, an international survey into computing education. So if you'd like to take over and share your screens, whichever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. We're so pleased to be able to join you today to share some of the work that we've been doing with some international colleagues. And thank you for joining us. So today I'll be presenting with my colleagues, Elizabeth and Monica, and Keith was able to help us in the preparation of this session, but he has some very exciting news in that he has welcomed a new baby, Charlie, and we just like to do a shout out and say congratulations. You know, we're thrilled to hear the news, and he might tune in, but we were delighted to let him know that he could spend some new time with his family. So he sends his apologies. So today what we'd be doing is we're walking through, telling you the story of the development of the METRECC instrument, and we'll be talking about some of the international collaboration that came to form this instrument, as well as sharing with you some pilot results that we had conducted and we've published. And some of the suggested pre-reading was the original IDICE working group report. So this is what our team formulated in terms of describing this instrument, and that's some background reading that might have helped you with the context, but if you didn't get around to reading it, that's fine. It might be something that you decide to come back to at another time. So I'll just go through some introductions. So today I thought we could share you know, what is a working group, how we gathered together to come to address this challenge. We'll be touching on some of the related work, then diving into what the METRECC instrument looks like and covering some of those research findings, particularly looking at what's happening in schools and around teacher self-esteem in computer science. We'll also have Monica talk through the process we undertook as a team to look at the evidence of reliability and validity of the survey, and also looking at extensions and future work opportunities. And we've provided some discussion prompts for the breakout session as well. So this project came about because it was part of a 2019 IDICE working group. And an IDICE working group is an intense collaboration between about 5 to 10 researchers from anywhere around the world who have applied to participate in a working group. And the goal is to produce a high value report, which is published in the IDICE proceedings. And it's focused around a topic of interest in computing education. So people can lead these projects and they nominate a topic with an abstract, and people apply to participate in these working groups. And so what you find is you have these really interesting collaborations with people with expertise, shared interests, all working on a common goal or a problem. And so what happens is there's some pre-conference work that's undertaken, and then researchers meet at the IDICE conference and undertake an intensive process of working through their project and preparing their final draft report, which is due at the end of the week. So you don't get to see a lot of the conference, but it is an amazing experience. And so I highly encourage you if you are interested to see that. And our working group was number 8, and we were looking at an international benchmark study of K-12 CS education in schools. And we had a brilliant team of researchers. We were thrilled to have everyone on board for this project. So we had members from around the world, including Australia, England, Ireland, Italy, Malta, Scotland, and the United States. And this project started virtually, so we were collaborating online, and then we met at the conference, which was in Aberdeen in Scotland. And that's where we undertook our intensive activities together. So here's a picture of our co-authors and IDSE working group members I'd like to share. And as I mentioned, our focus was on the looking at implementation of curriculum and classroom practice around the world in K-12 CS education. And so in this session, we're drawing on those pilot studies and looking at comparing and contrasting countries, and we'll talk through what that process was. So briefly, I'll touch on some of the related work that comes to form some of this background. So the genesis of our work really came about because analysis and previous attempts to assess and look at K-12 CS education implementation around the world is a challenge and perhaps takes some intensive work initially, but then it's could be quickly outdated. And so we discovered that there were some quantitative and qualitative reports that were out there, but nothing really that provided a tool that could be applied at scale and easily to collect the data that we were really looking for. We looked at reviews of curriculum landscape reports from Europe, the UK, US, and even Poland, looking at some of the information that were coming out of these reports. And when we were reviewing these reports and studies, we were really looking at how were they measuring what was happening, and so how were they collecting that data. We also looked at Hubweiser and his colleagues. They released an entire journal edition of articles related to K-12 CS education implementation, as well as a qualitative framework that emerged, the DASMA model. And finally, we were also looking at other working groups that may have worked in the area, and we discovered that there was a 2013 working group who surveyed 22 experts to look at K-12 CS education trends from around the world. And so these attempts have been providing information around the intended curriculum primarily, which is that policy level, what's happening, what's mandated across states and countries. But we were really interested in that enacted curriculum. So what are teachers doing in the classroom? So there were also case studies emerging from Bell and colleagues and some country-specific surveys that have provided some information and context around K-12 CS Ed and looking at what happens in classrooms. However, nothing really comprehensive and international that has been validated. So this led to us looking at wanting to develop the METRECC survey instrument. So when we look at curriculum components, there are 4 different types identified by Porter and Smithson, and these include the intended, enacted, assessed and learned curriculum. And our study chose to focus on the intended and enacted. Nolle and McLaughlin define the enacted curriculum as the operationalization of intended curriculum. So this is teachers taking the intended curriculum and looking at how they enact it in the classroom and looking at what is taught and how. And there are different ways people are defining these, but we chose to go with Porter and Smithson's definitions around those. So these included intended curriculum encompassing policy tools as curriculum standards, frameworks or guidelines that outline curriculum teachers are expected to deliver. And we know that some countries have mandated curriculum, optional curriculum, or they don't have a set curriculum, but there may be some local frameworks that they're working within. And then the enacted curriculum is the actual content that students are engaging with in the classroom, and this includes pedagogical practices that are being adopted, and in particular we were interested with CS education pedagogy, and it also includes teachers' use of different tools and technologies and the ways that they go about implementing that in the classroom. So due to K-12 CS education being such a young field, there's so much more that we really want to understand about this area, and that includes teachers' practices and the ways that they go about this. So we really wanted to curate those and compare and contrast and to see what's happening across the world. So while our research had that broader goal, we were also really interested in looking at what are the similarities and differences across countries in terms of intended CS curriculum topics and programming requirements, and also looking at how teachers were addressing the intended CS curriculum within their enacted CS curriculum in the classroom. And so we were really interested as well in terms of how can we capture enacted and intended CS curriculum across the world, and how might that be encompassed in a survey tool. So our working group process was to start with looking at prior work, so existing research papers, reports and surveys, and we were curating any instruments and questions that we could that had been preferably validated before, and we were putting these into a spreadsheet. So we were curating all of those existing instruments. We then moved on to using these existing works to develop our instrument, as well as to identify any new questions. And then we ran a pilot of the survey prior to meeting at IDSE in Aberdeen. And then when we arrived in Aberdeen, we were able to clean and analyse our data, mapping processes for comparing intended and enacted curriculum. And then we were also testing the survey instrument and looking at the pilot data for evidence of validity and reliability. And then we went through each question one by one using all of this data and doing a critique amongst ourselves. And then through that process, we were able to revise the survey instrument and then start to prepare our report and some pilot analysis as well. So from here, I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth, who is going to talk through what our instrument looked like and the different components.
So thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, that was a very clear account of the lead up to the actual instrument description that I'll go through in the next 10 minutes. So we'll describe the METRECC instrument that was developed. Rebecca explained about the intended and the enacted curriculum. So our goal for this instrument was to capture the intended curriculum, and for that we created a template for capturing required curriculum standards and policies in place for each country state. And for the enacted curriculum, we constructed a survey item to measure what was happening in classrooms, and this is from the teacher's perspective. So here we capture the intended curriculum using our newly created country report template. This template was designed to be completed by the survey administrators for the respective countries. The following themes were captured in the country report template, and we've organised them into 4 areas. So first was the country demographics and information relating to schools, such as the total population, the number of schools, and the number of teachers. Next, we've got the computing science curriculum state, or country plan standards and requirements. Third, we've got the year level with age comparisons mapped to prescribed curriculum and programming requirements. And finally, the general computing science topics covered. The enacted curriculum was captured by the teacher survey. The group developed and refined a set of key survey categories that were of interest internationally in terms of enacted computing science education curriculum. Collaboratively, members curated questions from surveys with evidence of reliability and validity, resulting in 88 initial example questions from 11 sources. The survey included 11 sections and a total of 53 questions. The sections are presented here on this slide. I won't read through every single section, but I think it's important to note that each section can be used individually. So perhaps you're interested in one particular category, you don't have to do the whole survey, and I think that's a real strength of this particular instrument. We ran a pilot study across 7 countries, and from that we received 700 plus responses to this survey, The full survey took only, on average, 35 to 40 minutes. And then what we had to do was remove any incomplete responses. The last question asked whether respondents would allow their responses to be in a public data set, and that left us with 244 responses. The participant sample is shown in this pie chart next, but basically we got 61% female and 37% male. And again, scrolling down, I think it's important to realise that all were teaching computing in school in some capacity, but we certainly did have a broad range of participants. The age groups taught range from our very youngest learners at age 3, right through to the end of secondary school, to the ages 18 and 19. Participants could select more than one teaching across age groups, and we found that some teachers, perhaps in secondary, were working alongside their primary colleagues, supporting them in implementing the computing science curriculum. The majority of respondents are teaching across middle to secondary years, with some teachers working with early to primary years. The next section is about what's actually happening in schools. So what did we find from our pilot study? This table presents the results for the intended curriculum, broad topics that are explicitly or implicitly defined in country or state curriculum documents. And that was quite an interesting read. We mapped what was said in the intended curriculum, our country reports, and checked them against the percentage of teachers who said, yes, I teach this. And you can see an example of that on the screen at the moment. Here we mapped the intended curriculum's programming requirements to what teachers reported using. In England, which had the greatest representation of teachers across grade levels. In yellow, lower percentages of teachers reported using symbolic programming, no text such as flowcharting, describing sequences as steps, and visual programming in elementary grades. The lack of teaching with symbolic and visual coding illustrates a mismatch in the intended and enacted curriculum. Higher percentages of teachers reported using text-based programming languages, matching more closely the intended curriculum. Here is another version in which we can see how programming languages use is evolving across year levels across all countries. We were interested in seeing if there were changes with age groups, and we can see text-based programming starting to be used around ages 11 to 12 more broadly. It is interesting to see the pattern of hybrid in green, that's both text and visual, being used across those age groups where teachers would transition students from one to the other. Additionally, visual, Scratch or Snap, symbolic, Scratch Junior, and unplugged programming still play a role across all year levels, increasing in use. We asked teachers to tell us their primary motivation for selecting programming languages. Here we can see that across all countries, the majority of reasons were pedagogical and to align with student needs. Less so, teachers viewed school-determined reasons and curriculum-determined reasons as influencing their choice of programming languages. The green highlights are the top reasons teachers selected programming languages. This included items such as appropriateness for age, cost, availability, stage in students' learning, and because of a need to scaffold learners. We see that school and curriculum determined reasons for choosing a programming paradigm were not primary motivations. Finally, standard deviations were low by comparison for teachers' programming choices, very consistent across all countries. We hope that future use of METRECC tool will provide additional data and insight.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. So now I'll go through some of our findings around teachers' CS self-esteem. And this is explored in our paper at IDSE this year, an international pilot study of K-12 teachers' computer science self-esteem. So if you're interested, more detail is in that paper there. So just to sort of capture what we mean by these definitions is that the term self-esteem is often used interchangeably with self-efficacy and other similar variations. In this context, we look at self-esteem as more broadly concerned with a person's positive or negative attitudes or their perceptions about their self. And that includes their emotional response to the way that people experience and evaluate themselves. And it includes things like judgments about skills, abilities, and so on. And so in this context, we were really interested in understanding how teachers felt about their abilities and their skills in computer science. And this compares to self-efficacy, which is much more task-specific and concerned with a person's belief in their own capabilities around specific tasks. So just to show you what I mean here, we have some similar statements presented in different ways. So the first being around global self-esteem. So this is, I feel that I have a number of good qualities, and it could be relating to computer science. The second being domain-specific self-esteem, which is I feel that I have a number of good Java programming qualities. So that's a little bit more specific there. And then lastly is a self-efficacy example. So I can write syntactically correct programming statements. So that's very task-specific. So we were concerned with how teachers really felt about their abilities and skills as a computer scientist as well. So here we have the collective average of teachers' reported agreements against these self-esteem scales. And the teacher self-esteem scale included in the METRECC surveys is comprised of these statements, and teachers then use a Likert scale to provide a rating against them as either being low or very high on a 7-point scale. And what you can do with this is plug it and play it into your own survey. So you can take this component around measuring self-esteem and then perhaps combine it around with a teacher professional development component or their enacted curriculum. So here we were interested in their self-esteem overall and how they were feeling. And we can see here that the first set of statements in the red box, they're related to negative perceptions around self-esteem. For example, I certainly feel useless at computer science at times. And the green box includes positive statements. For example, I feel I have a number of good computer science qualities. And so we see here that overall teachers had a high level of agreement towards those positive statements, more so than they did for the negative statements, which is good to see. So now we're going to have a look further into the CS self-esteem according to our variables. And I should note here that the PCA algorithm produced a single value with high self-esteem as a negative value, while teachers with a low CS self-esteem is reported as positive. But in the graphs on the following slides, we've flipped these axes so you can see them as positive self-esteem being above and negative below. So we hear in our exploration of the data, age, when we were looking at the prior research, we found that age of CS1 students had previously shown to be a factor when predicting success in programming, but we didn't find any significant differences between groups when we were looking at our teacher data. But we did notice that there were reported differences, but they weren't significant with certain age groups. For example, teachers between 19 and 29 and 50 and 59 reporting higher self-esteem. And in our search of the literature, we found that apparently mastering computer science at the industry level takes around 10,000 hours or full-time working years. And so what we sought to find out was how many years, or was there a difference when it came to years teaching computer science? And unsurprisingly, we found that teachers with no CS experience teaching computer science had significantly lower self-esteem in CS than other groups. And the data suggests that teachers start to build their confidence, their self-esteem around 4 years and up. We also found that male teachers reported significantly higher computer science self-esteem than the female teachers. And also that primary teachers reported significantly lower self-esteem than secondary teachers. So future studies could compare the level of computer science required for primary and secondary level teachers, and perhaps sort of unpack that a little bit further in terms of what is required at those age groups in terms of their confidence or their self-esteem or self-efficacy, for example. We found no significant differences between any of the country groups, but only England, Italy, and Scotland showed a positive CS self-esteem. Further work is really required to unpack this finding to determine if there are local factors that perhaps influence this, such as curriculum, professional learning support, and qualifications. And no significant differences between location groups means were determined. However, we do notice slight variations in means between the countries and by regions that might be worth exploring further. So our key findings overall, we found females, primary teachers, and those with no CS teaching experience reported significantly lower CS self-esteem than their counterparts. We didn't find any significant differences in age group differences, but we did see some trends that suggest it's warranting further research. But we did come out with more questions in that paper, and we wanted to look at what interventions or professional development can improve teacher CS self-esteem, and particularly for cohorts with significantly lower CS self-esteem. And also, how long does it take teachers to really build that CS self-esteem, and what impact does low teacher CS self-esteem have on student learning in computer science? So I'm going to hand over to Monica now, who's going to walk us through the process for testing for reliability and validity. Thanks, Monica.
All right, so we looked at different aspects of reliability and validity given the time we had in the working group. Since it was condensed, we didn't have the luxury of doing things like a pilot test on the survey, unfortunately. So first we examined reliability on the two constructs that were in the instrument, which were motivation and self-esteem. Motivation had a Chromebox alpha of 0.78 and self-esteem had a 0.89, and anything over 0.70 can be considered reliable. So we felt that those two actually were really strong. We didn't do retest reliability as well due to time, unfortunately, but this is something that could be done in the future. All right, next slide. All right, so for evidence of validity, we looked at several areas. One was construct validity, and we looked at face validity and concurrent validity here. For population validity, we looked at the number of teachers per country, and then we did a test for goodness of fit. Not for everything, actually. We only did it for, which one was it? Oh, the number of teachers. And actually, we looked at goodness of fit for some other areas as well, but I'll talk about that here in a minute. And then sampling validity. Next slide. All right, so for face validity, we had internal face validity, and again, we did have a little bit of external validity, but it wasn't enough to actually count, I feel, for face validity. And face validity, if you don't know, so this is when you're actually looking at it, the instrument and all the items in the instrument to make sure that they make sense. They're measuring what they set out to measure, And with the 10 researchers on the team from the 7 different countries, we reviewed each question more than once. And as Rebecca mentioned earlier, we actually started with other instruments and pulled that data from other instruments first where we could find them. And then we adapted them to our needs. So there was some reliability already of some of those items coming into our survey, which was good. The pilot survey, we went through a number of revisions before we sent it out. And then after we launched it and the data was analyzed, we again sat down through each question on the instrument. And this was a very long entailed process. So that took us approximately 4 hours of our time, just dedicated to looking at each instrument, each item in the instrument, making sure that it was absolutely needed, making sure that the wording was correct, making sure that the data itself reflected what we would expect to reflect, so there weren't strange anomalies in that. And that resulted in what we call METRECC version 1.2. For construct validity, there were 2 constructs only in the survey instrument. Everything else was descriptive data. What do you do? How long do you do it? What types of tools do you use? The 2 constructs, as mentioned earlier, are self-esteem and motivation. For self-esteem, we compared the results to a similar scale in another instrument, and it did have similar reliability, so we felt good about that. The other instrument was actually used for undergraduate students, so we couldn't do just a cross comparison between the teachers and the undergraduates, but we did over the course of months later, the past year, we did compare the results and found somewhat similar results as well. For the motivation scale, this was unique to the METRECC survey, so we had nothing else to compare it to, but it did pass, as I mentioned, the internal face validity checks. So for population validity, one of the things that we looked at was country representation. And you can see on the chart on the right, hopefully you can see that okay, but the number of teachers per country, K-12 teachers, the percentage of teachers as a total of that, the number were actually responded in the study of the 244 responses, and the percentage as well. So with the goodness of fit then, the graph on the left shows the what we'd expect, our desired, I should say, outcome, and then the actual outcome is the survey responses. So actually the US had the most responses, but we were still underrepresented. England was overrepresented, Italy under, and Ireland and Scotland were over. So the goodness of fit actually had a strong Kramer's V of 0.51. But looking at this data, we kind of caution just accepting that given the low numbers, especially from Malta and Australia. All right, next slide. Okay, so extensions and future work. We've done a few things already, but some of the limitations of our work were, this is the pilot study, which we really emphasized. Huge generalizations based on the data here would be cautioned since our sample size is only n equals 244. Our future work may include administrating the surveys across more countries and with larger cohorts, or even within a country. It doesn't necessarily have to be outside of a country, but even within a country you could administer it and see what the differences are maybe across the different regions of the country. We're considering separating and analyzing the primary and secondary years due to their differences in topics and programming language requirements. Everything is all inclusive in this survey, but especially as K-12 grows in the primary sector, separating that out and making it more relevant to primary school teachers would be important. And then further research to monitor changes over time in terms of enacted topics and languages and teacher motivations would be important to look at too. And then a recent extension of this work was done in South Asia. I did that with a team of undergraduate students at my college, Knox College, where I've been teaching. Oh, that's kind of out of order, but let me just jump back here. This is actually the METRECC survey instrument, which you can access. So through csedresearch.org, If you go to evaluation instruments and type METRECC in the search bar, you'll find two. One is the original METRECC survey, which you see here. Not only does it have the original version and then the latest version of the METRECC instrument, it also has the data and then the template as well. So you could actually download the data and play with it and see what kind of things you come up with too. Right, next. For the METRECC South Asia instrument, so this was an article that was published last month actually in the ISER conference, the ACM ISER conference. And we took, my team, 4 undergraduate students and I took the survey instrument, and 3 of the students on the team were from South Asia. So we reinterpreted the METRECC instrument for a South Asia context. And some of the things we learned and that resulted in the changes of the instrument is that gifted in South Asia means those students with special needs. Whereas, for example, in the US, gifted means in the top 10%. So we actually had to clarify what we meant by that. We added options for curriculum that require students to write programs by hand. So this is a common practice where there's limited access to computers in some of those areas within those countries. And the countries we targeted, I should mention too, were Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. So in our options of what tools do you use, we expanded that to include writing programming, right? Actually writing code by hand. We restated computational thinking, which is not commonly used there. A lot of teachers did not know that term. We reframed computer science and programming within ICT, as it's often they're taught within ICT. We added a bot detection question just to make sure it wasn't going to be hijacked by a bot, at least a sanity check on that. And then we also reduced the survey to 10 to 15 minutes maximum. So this helped with a couple reasons. We don't know exactly what kind of time commitments are available from those teachers and when to keep it down, but also we were concerned about internet access and having the teachers being able to actually have an extended time to actually take it without any broadband issues. All right, and that instrument is also available on csedresearch.org, and the instrument itself, actually, we have a video that we created, a lecture, basically a 10-minute video on the instrument and how it was created and our results as well. And that is available, the link is available on that page. You'll see it if you go farther down into author notes. So if you want to take a few minutes to actually learn more about how that tool was developed and the data that we collected, what we found, you can go there. All right, so some discussion prompts for you. We wanted to actually see if you had any other questions as well for us, but also, what are your experiences, observations about the enacted CS curriculum in classrooms, and how does it compare to what is intended? And some of you may even have personal observations on this in your own classrooms. And then what other variables and questions do you think would be interesting or valuable to explore within the METRECC data set?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Monica, Rebecca, and Elizabeth. We do that, you know, we can all give a jazz hands or clap or whatever to say thank you. And thank you also for giving us a couple of questions. That's really helpful to start us off in our breakout groups. And so we'll try and remember those when we get into the breakout groups. When you get to your breakout groups, do spend like 1 minute just to introduce each other, you know, introduce yourself to everybody else. You know, you can meet new people, that's always good. And then you can also use the Zoom share whiteboard function, which is under the share screen button. If one of you wants to take notes, don't forget to take a screenshot of your whiteboard before Diana chucks you out of the breakout group. And without further ado, we're going to break into groups for more discussion. Thanks, Diana. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I'm trying to do too many things at once. I am trying to post our whiteboard, the picture of all of our questions, which were many questions, into the chat at the same time as chair this seminar. So I'm going to abandon that at the moment and start and do my proper chairing job. So I hope you had really good discussions. In our group, we had loads of questions. So my group would have to remember those from memory while I faff around with uploading them into the chat. But let's see if any other groups have got questions. Do you want to either use the reactions tab to sort of wave your thumb or hand or something at me, or wave your hand at me like this if you've got a question, or you could put it into the chat if you would like me to read it out instead, or just signal that you've got a question. I can start with some of our questions. So we had lots of discussions around different countries needing, whether there were different versions of the survey, and interested in, you know, Monica having to adjust the survey for South Asia, and if there was any other experiences of things that were maybe different in different countries that you thought, any of you, that you should, you know, would maybe need to change or were made aware of through the results. That's one of the things we talked about. And in our group, we had people from Belgium, Ireland, Uganda, Kenya, China. We were very international, so we were representing lots of countries. So I don't know which of you could answer about the cultural adaptation of the survey.
So for this, I should say, you know, I didn't really frame what we talked about, but if you go to the link and watch the video, you would learn that it was framed on the fact that the METRECC survey instrument was created. All of us are in what the World Bank would classify as high income countries. And I feel like there's a need to really consider what's going on in other countries as well. A lot of the research in CS education is only coming from high income countries, but it may be the case that we're unknowingly contributed to the cultural divide and the economic divide between high income and low income countries, because they know they need tech, right? And they need to teach tech in K through 12 to make them economically competitive with other countries. So that was kind of like the motivation to it. And then when we actually looked at the adapting the survey, not only did we have 3 people on the team who are from those countries that could help discern which questions would work and what wouldn't work. We also had face validity with experts, so external face validity with experts in Nepal and Pakistan. So they were able to go through with their knowledge in K-12 computing education and you know, go through line by line and tell us which worked and which didn't work, and ask questions like, what are you even talking about? Because we're using a different terminology. So as far as adapting METRECC to a different country, I would probably revert to a lot of external face validity with experts, some K-12 CS Ed experts, and have them review it, each question, make sure it makes sense in the context, and make sure it's complete. Like, we didn't consider, because we're high income countries, everyone has a computer to use to test their code. Almost all the students have that accessibility in some way or another. We didn't consider, what about the fact that you would write a program and not have a computer to test it on? So that was expanded as well.
Good. Did anyone else have questions around that or comments on that sort of area of the adaptation? Jean?
I guess this question also came from our breakout room, and so since you mentioned writing out code by hand where they can't compile it, how was that treated in the results you classified as like text-based, or block-based or whatever in the presentation? But if you're writing code by hand, was that in its own categorization? Was it the language that it was approximating? How was that treated in the survey?
It was another line. So in that same line of the same categorization, it was general programming, without, I think it was without a computer. That's what we called it. But then we also gave a definition just to make sure that everybody was on the same page. You know, for example, writing it out by hand. And then there was general programming using a computer.
Okay. So my group, I have put our questions in the chat. So if you want to go and look at them, you can ask them. Anybody else got any other questions for any of the presenters? Richard.
My question really was, it's a burning issue for me, was that I really liked all the analysis. I thought it was really good, but I had a question right at the beginning of it, is how do we know that that teacher is qualified to teach computer science? What's the level of qualification or experience? Because when I saw in some of the questions that some of the respondents were coming back as saying they're not confident or they're unpracticed, that sort of implies to me that they're not qualified or that they haven't reached a certain level to actually do the teaching. So testing that qualification at the beginning will really impact all the results. If someone is properly qualified, has experience, then they shouldn't be phased by trying to teach it. And then my second point was around the curriculum. In the UK, we've now got a published curriculum for Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 4, which we didn't really have before. And it's sort of mandatory, should be mandatory, but maybe not, it's a bit iffy. But if you're teaching against a proper certified mandated curriculum, how much more confident does that make the teachers? I think that's quite a big factor. If that's not there, then you don't know if you're teaching to the right curriculum or not, or the right standard. So those sort of factors, they're not, it doesn't imply impact on what you've done, but I think it's just factors that sort of scope what you've been doing. Don't know whether that makes sense.
And any of you want to pick that up around the qualifications of the teachers in the survey, maybe from the findings?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, I think, around the qualifications and the confidence of teachers. We did have qualifications including teaching and any CS related qualifications in the survey. So it definitely would be interesting to unpack that and dive into splicing that data to see if that plays a role. But yeah, I guess we were interested as well in sort of in some countries where new curriculum is rolling out. For example, in Australia, we have the digital technologies curriculum that's been introduced in 2015. And so all our teachers now are required to teach it from the first year of school to year 10. But we have teachers who, for them, it's a brand new subject area. And so their confidence is likely very low now. But then being able to track that over time and seeing if, you know, engagement in professional development or perhaps additional qualifications or even just time, if that plays a role in building their confidence around teaching CS. So yeah, at the moment, we with the survey in the pilot, we sort of just wanted to capture anyone who was teaching computer science, whether that be like voluntary or that it was part of their curriculum and they needed to teach it. But it will be really interesting to track that over time, I think.
Jean, or Celia, Celia saying something. Jean, you had a comment in the chat.
Yeah, I just want to say I want to follow up the point just made by Rebecca. I just think it's so important to do this again in a few years' time because it's so new in most countries, and we are, I think, in England we have computer science. We've got a lot of support around, but still it's very new, and I just feel that to have it when things have got bedded down. And to be honest, in our Scratch Maths project, our teachers were transformed, actually. After 3 or 4 years, teachers were like a different, we were looking at their pedagogy and it changed because they suddenly, you know, it was not new. They were confident in building their own programs and sharing. And I just think it takes a while. And anything that's a slightly challenging and a new knowledge domain, it's obvious it would take a while, really, wouldn't it? So do it again later.
Yeah. And it comes with practice, just getting out there and doing it. So we've done some surveys with teachers around self-efficacy and assessment practices in computer science, and we found it was really just the significant differences were how far they were along even just trying assessments, and whether their school had formally required assessment as opposed to some of our schools that don't really require it. So just diving in and practicing that, and just, yeah. And we have layers of depth. So teachers at that fundamental level, but they'll be hungry for, you know, deeper learning around computer science. And maybe with that, they gain some more confidence.
Sorry, apologies for my phone there. And Jean, did you want to say something about self-esteem? I mean, I think we've talked about experience.
Oh, I guess it was more a comment than a question, but I guess I just wanted to say that I don't think self-esteem is necessarily a prerequisite to teaching computing. Just because in my experience, I've encountered teachers who exhibit signs of like lower, I guess maybe lower domain-specific self-esteem. But when I observed them in a classroom, they do it perfectly well. So I think it's sometimes at some point, as like Celia said, it's like experience and comfort rather than like actually being able to stand in front of the classroom and do it.
Yeah, we also talked about something similar in our group in terms of the fact that self-esteem can be linked to the number of subjects that a teacher is teaching. So I wondered if there was any information on whether they were specialist computing teachers, if they just taught computing and therefore had the opportunity to build more self-esteem in that sort of domain, or whether, so for example, where it says primary teachers have lower self-esteem than secondary teachers, might that be linked to the fact that they're teaching a number of different subjects across the curriculum and therefore they perhaps don't think that they're as proficient in teaching it, but maybe, as Jean says, they're actually doing a perfectly good job.
I just want to mention one thing too with the self-esteem scale. So self-efficacy is, there are certain rules and of what you would measure for self-efficacy. And we thought that this was going to be self-efficacy, and it turned out to be self-esteem, and they are actually related, but they are different. And if you talk to psychologists, self-esteem can go up and down even throughout a day for a person on anything, where self-efficacy would be more, this is how confident they feel, not particularly on any given day, but it would be more consistent across days. So although the self-esteem is in the instrument, it could be worthwhile to look at bringing in a different self-efficacy scale and use it with this instrument as well.
Mm-hmm. So can I ask as any the team what your plans are for any sort of, you've got some ideas of future work. I really like the future work slide. Is there anything, you know, Monica, you've just done your additional study. Any other plans to take this any further? As Celia says, we kind of need these punctuated surveys, or is anybody else here rushing off to the Monica's database to download the survey and have a look at it and tweak it for their own country? Anyone think they'd like to use it, or where are we going next with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, we were just talking earlier, and in the working group party, we had discussed trying to capture and monitor the intended curriculum over time. And so it might be that we could set up some kind of interactive template where on the CSED research site where the instrument is, where we might be able to you know, sort of have that ongoing interactive curation of what's happening across the world. So it's not something that's, you know, it's sort of like have to reinitiate every time, but definitely running the survey again, I think regularly would be a good option, as well as with more countries, and also to see if there are any changes in items. So I think there was a question around are there any things that we noticed in terms of the survey questions, but it's also the survey items. Like we were listing options of you know, pedagogy and resources and tools, and some of them might not be relevant to countries, and some of them some countries may have their own preferences or tools and resources that aren't listed. So it'll be interesting to see if those items evolve. but yeah, we would be very keen to work with, you know, anyone interested in adopting the survey and trialing it within their country. I guess also, does anyone have any ideas for perhaps other ways to analyze the data, or other questions you might include, or other components as well?
There's a question for the audience. Any other things we could include? Are there ways we can analyze the data? I think we're coming to the end, so this probably will be the last comment. Anybody think they want? Catherine?
Yeah, just in terms of our group, I will only say that we came up with a whole new instrument as well, where we decided it would also be good to measure the learned curriculum and compare that to the enacted curriculum. But we recognised that there would be significant challenges collecting that data at pupil level and the ethics around that and things. So, but yeah, it's the start of curriculum mapping, we felt, in a lot of ways as well.
That sounds like a working group 2.0.
I mean, it's always tempting to start, you know, I mean, that's a different thing, but generally, to write another survey question, to write your own survey when you want to do something. But I think it's really good to look at existing surveys. They've been validated, work with those, adapt them where you need to. And on the CSED research site, if you're looking at something else, you know, there are lots of different, that Monica and her colleagues have kind of collated lots of other instruments that are validated you can look at to use for your research. So I think for me, it feels like it makes computing education a stronger field if we really use robust, validated instruments that other people have used and we've got lots of data for. So that was just a comment. Okay, I think we're coming to an end, and this is our longer format. So I'd just like to thank, if you'll wave your hands or put thanks in the chat or whatever, thank Rebecca and Monica and Liz for making their journeys from Australia and US and Scotland to come to see us at Raspberry Pi. It's really great. Thank you very much. Please do connect with them on Twitter and use the hashtag RPF seminars to carry on talking about it. We have a research update newsletter that comes out every term. If you'd like to sign up for that, the link is on the screen. And otherwise, do come along next time. The next seminar is at the beginning of October, and we've got Shushi Grover, and she's coming to talk to us about formative assessment. So thank you very much, everybody.